Welcome to all of our many participants from near and from far and from wherever you're joining us. It is, as always, my great pleasure to be in the company of my revered teacher and dear friend, Professor Ruth Wisse. Ruth is Professor Emerita of Yiddish and Comparative Literature at Harvard, and many of us know her particularly in these last years through her important and wide-reaching work as Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Tikvah Fund. Her most recent authored book is a fascinating memoir entitled Free as a Jew, a personal memoir of national self-liberation, which I commend to your attention and which perhaps we should have a different conversation one day, one evening here through Beit Agnon about the memoir. But we are here to discuss her most recent book, a translation with a critical introduction and afterward, my Quarrel with Hersh Rasseyner by the great Yiddish author Chaim Grade in a new translation by Ruth. My Quarrel with Hersh Rasseyner, like so much of Grade's work, and of course, I'm sure many of us are familiar with, many of us, myself first amongst them, unable to read Grade in the original Yiddish. But I'm sure that many of us are familiar with his writing from the translations that do exist. We are still not yet in possession of a complete translated edition of the Kol Kitveh Grade, the alle Schriften, if my Yiddish is correct. Please correct me, Ruth.
Very good. Not at all.
The entirety of his canon, although there is work in progress to bring more to the English reading public. But of course, many of us are familiar with the classic, the Yeshiva, known in Yiddish as Tzemach Atlas, my mother's Sabbath days, and other important works. And like our own Agnon, who we of course put on the highest pedestal here at Beit Agnon, in Grade we witness an author who's doing a very serious job of putting an autobiographical presentation into his writings, so much so that the reader might be forgiven for thinking that he's reading autobiography, although we must always be mindful of the fact that indeed we're reading works of fiction, imaginative fiction, even when there is that serious autobiographical layer. Ruth, in your introduction to the new edition, you describe meeting Grade as a young student in 1960, and you were struck by how much this flesh and blood character who you met, already a great man of Yiddish letters, how much he resembled the character that you had been studying in his long poem, Mussernix. So just before we get into Hersh Rasseyner, share with us some of your memories of Grade the man and Grade the author, and how you were able to put these two characters together.
Well, thanks very, very much, Jeffrey, for this invitation to be able to talk here about the book and about Grade. In fact, it's basically as the author Grade that I got to know him, because I never met him personally in any other capacity except the person who was giving a talk as the author and the person who wanted to discuss with me his work. The first work that I ever undertook in Yiddish literature was a translation of Chaim Grade's book, Der Brunnen, The Well. And that is a long story of how that came to be. Everything that had to do with his work was really quite complicated. Partly complicated because of the man, partly complicated because of his wife who was in the background, partly complicated because of a marvelous story that Cynthia Ozick once wrote under the title Envy, or Yiddish in America. The context there is that when Grade came to the United States, it was a flourishing Yiddish literary community, all right, but it was very small. And the sparring among the various members was extremely intense. And I know that the name of Isaac Bashevis Singer is going to come up sooner or later. I have to say that Isaac Bashevis Singer never took part in this, because he had a different personality altogether, different temperament. And it was the kind of thing, playing the demon as he did. He was the bad boy all along. So he pretended to be above it all, but in fact, he knew that he had the winning card, because he read America very well, and he knew that if he played this devilish part in his writing and in his life, he'd be rewarded for it, which of course he was, and finally got, the Nobel Prize for Literature. Grade is a very different personality. Grade was a very serious person. It's not just that he came from the Lithuanian tradition of elite, hard Lithuanian intellect and the emphasis on hard intellect. But even within the group that, for example, he was a member of in the 1930s, Jung Wilne, his friend, Avram Sutzkever, was a very lively personality, also very intellectual in his own way and so forth, but not at all like Grade. Grade bore the scars of the Musar yeshiva that he describes. Now, the truth is that when you read the book that you mentioned, which is, I think, amazing, an amazing memoir. No, not, I mean, the yeshiva, but I meant my mama's Shabbos, my mother's Sabbath days, which I also commend to everyone. It's an amazing study of a woman, first of all, his mother. And it's also very richly autobiographical about Vilna in those years. When you read the conditions of his life, living with his mother in one room behind a smithy that had the fire going, all the time in the front room, and they lived in the back room. This widow was extremely poor, selling apples in the courtyard of their building, of the place where they lived. This very proud young man living under these circumstances with his mother, this proud young man going to the Musar yeshiva and having to eat days at other people's homes and things. Well, you see, he was formed by very hard circumstances, and it played into his personality. I don't want to use the word unpleasant, but I never had a pleasant exchange with him.
I'm sure someone must have, but it wasn't.
I'm sure that they did. His students, by the way, when he taught for Isidore Tversky at Harvard for a couple of years, some of his students really, they don't care about the bad part. They don't care that he put them down many times. And I didn't care either, frankly, at all. It was such...
As we say about Agnon, you can take the boy out of Buchach, but you can't take the Buchach out of the boy. So here too, you can take the boy out of Navardik, but Navardik never leaves the...
Well, that's what he said about it. He says that right here, that they said, the person who is known Navardik will never have enjoyment in life.
Maybe we should just add in parentheses for some viewers that may be a little less familiar. Navardik was one of the flagship, if not the flagship, yeshivot of the Musar movement, this kind of pietistic, hyper-ethicized train of European Jewish study, which put intense focus on the reformation of the student's character, the purifying of the student's character. And as you say, although there were different trends within the Musar movement, Navardik was certainly distinguished as, perhaps the most severe.
Under the Rosh Yeshiva that they were then studying with, right. Rosh Yeshiva Hurwitz, yeah.
Let's get into Hersh Rasseyner. The book is, when it was first published in Yiddish, was in the early 50s, was presented as an essay, which is itself an interesting, well, it might be an interesting sleight of hand, or it might be an interesting literary choice. But we read it today, and certainly in your edition, we read it as a kind of dialogue between really principally only two characters. There's a third minor character that comes in later, who had been excised from earlier editions of the work. But these two encounters between Hersh Rasseyner, who is now living as a Rosh Yeshiva after the war. He's living as a Rosh Yeshiva in Germany, of all places, after the Shoah, trying to resurrect the Sheirus Sapleta, the remnant of a Jewry left in Europe. And Chaim, the character who we imagine to be the projection of the author himself, who is now a secular, they had once been, colleagues on the bench at the yeshiva. They've now gone in different directions, and Chaim is now a secularized modern Yiddish author. He's a former Navardic Nick, to whatever degree one can ever move away from that. And having gone in these two different directions, particularly after the Holocaust, they meet after their two short encounters, very, very kind of just setting up the characters, one in 1937 and one in 1939. But probably about 90% of the book is this one long dialogue on one long afternoon when they meet quite by chance on the streets of Paris.
In the metro of Paris.
In the metro of Paris.
Paris. Yes.
And this kind of debate that they have, really a tour de force, and it's been filmed twice. I mean, it almost begs for a stage production or a film production. I mean, it almost lends itself automatically to that kind of discussion. And we're gonna, in a few moments, we're gonna look at a clip from one of those. That's the frame of this discussion. But you open the very first line of your introduction to this work, which you have now, of course, brought back to our attention. You write, "My Quarrel with Hersh Rasseyner is a classic of modern Jewish literature and modern Jewish thought." So maybe I'm pitching a softball to you, my friend, but I want to push you on this. Can you delineate for us the difference between modern Jewish literature and modern Jewish thought? Can we have one without the other? What makes Hersh Rasseyner both A and B? And in what way is it both a work of literature and a work of machshava, of Jewish thought?
Well, it's a good question, a very good question. Look, there may be thought in, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. I mean, there is an idea there. One fell down and broke his crown and she came tumbling after. I mean, one can make a nimshal out of that. One can make a whole drasha out of that. So there can be thought in even, just the most casual kind of rhyme and literary work. I think that works define themselves. And you said right at the start that they didn't know what to call this. I'm not sure whether it's Grade who called it an essay the first time it was published. It was published in the Yiddish magazine in New York. And we never know in these cases whether it was the editorial decision to put that there or what. But if he called it that, and if it's so much as you describe, a contest of ideas, it's all about a contest of ideas, then you know that this work of literature really is focusing on the content being the ideas. The other thing is that we know this also interestingly through the idea that you just presented. The movie, The Quarrel, was made based on this work. George Telushkin and David Brandes fell in love with this work, and they decided that they would write a play based on this work and then film it, and they filmed it. If you take a look at the film,
there are a number. The whole thing is not available, but there are a number of long clips of that film available on YouTube. If you
you can get the film if you want.
The whole film can be found.
No, I think that people can buy the film if they want to. I mean, it is available, but I'm only mentioning it because of this. When they made the film, they had to fill in everything that Grade had left out. So one of the answers to your question, how do you know this is a work of thought? You see, for them, when you make a movie, they couldn't make a movie of Jewish thought. They had to make a film that had real flesh and blood dramatization. So what did they do? They filled in everything that Grade had left out. And to me, these things are so, one of the most interesting thing is the way in which this book is built. Not beginning in 1948, one could ask the question, why didn't he just begin in 1948? What's the point of those two early sessions?
Before the
yes, the one in 1937 and one in 1939, and then in 1948, which you say takes about 90%, but those two early ones are not only accidental, but they are absolutely necessary for the rest of the work. So the question is, here are these two men who have been together in the Novaratok Yeshiva. They've met on these two occasions beforehand, fiercely competitive, very angry with one another. They meet in 1948 in a metro in Paris. What would you expect them to do? I know what I would expect. I would say, Hersh,
you're still alive. How did you make it through?
How did you survive? And then, also which is put into the movie, what about your parents? What happened to your wife?
Your children.
And your children, because Wilner, the Grade figure, did not have, he lost his wife, but he was married. He didn't have children, but he was married. Wouldn't they have reminisced?
It would have been the conversation that actually took place in real life on the streets of Paris and New York and Yerushalayim throughout the late 40s and 50s, when people discovered each other, shocked that the other one had also made it through Auschwitz.
Exactly. So if we read the text that's there, and I am not in any way suggesting that we try to rewrite this, but when you read the text that's there and you see how focused it is and how they get right into the quarrel and how they get right into the between them, you see that what they are is what's really on their mind is this thing that they have been carrying with them all the time.
Right. Well, there's that beautiful line where Hersh says, you may wonder why my argument with you comes out so free-flowing, like the daily Amidah, like my daily utilized prayer, I'm repeating it by heart. Well, I want you to know that throughout all of these years and everything that I went through, I was always in conversation with you. I was always arguing with you. I never let it go. But it's also, you see, despite this, I mean, it's like a clash of titans, but you see that the eros,
yes, of course,
both
yes.
Yeah. For those of us here at Beit Agnon, I read it through, and I'm reminded, of course, of Agnon's magnificent work, two translated as two Torah scholars who were in our town. This kind of clash of titans. They meet each other. They love each other despite all of the.
Well, look, every culture has its own forms, and the classic form of Jewish literary culture is these two men discussing a Talmudic passage, is the model of the Chevruta. That's the classic kind of model. I once wrote an article on two Jews talking, and the thesis that I never generalize. I try never to generalize or to write theories about literature or anything like that. So this is one of the few times when I really wrote this kind of arc, and I said that that there's a kind of form of Yiddish literature and Hebrew literature too, of two Jews talking. That's in Tevye the Dairyman and in this work. And you can put together a whole list of works where this idea of two Jews talking, of course, how else would a writer emerge out of classic Jewish life without this model? We're talking about men, of course, but men were the writers in those days, and that's what they came from. So it's a very natural form for them to get into. But what we're saying here is that the intensity of it, and you're right, the intensity of it is where is not to be overlooked. The ideas are there. We can talk about them, and we will. But the ideas are framed in a certain language, and they are really passionate because these are not just ideas. I mean, these are not ideas about, I could tell you, Jeffrey, what you should do with Beit Agnon. Maybe you would do this, maybe you would do that. That's an idea that you could do with any. Why don't you take this book instead of another book when you're talking about it? It's not like that. This is a matter of life or death to them. I mean, what did we come through, and what are we left with? And what is it to mean to be Jewish? It is a struggle of life and death, and it has that very strong feeling about it.
Well, we spoke earlier, you mentioned that, you know, the comparison almost begs itself between Grade and Hersh Rasseyner. It's silly to rank, you know, two world-class authors like Songs on American Bandstand or something.
Yeah.
But there is something interesting. And again, this might be an interesting conversation, again, for a different night when we have time to focus on it. The interesting moment that Yiddish is having in America, worldwide, but specifically amongst American Jews, again, that Yiddish literature is having with the arrival of your translation and the projects that are meant to be coming, I think, principally from the Shokin Press in the United States, which is part of Random House, to reissue Grade's existing translations and to produce new ones. So this is part of like larger, interesting cultural trends, which, you know, by and large, we're certainly in favor of. But we want to turn our attention now to a particular passage in the book. We together, Ruth, you and I decided to focus on one particular passage in the book as a kind of exemplar of the quarrel, of the debate, the Krieg between Chaim and Hersh. It's a section at the very end of chapter 5, for those of you that are following along at home that have the book. It's the section that corresponds in the English volume to page 45 to 48. And just to kind of set it up, it's this discussion of Hersh, who is still so stuck to his guns, stuck to his ideology, and Chaim, who has gone off in this other direction. And they're debating, well, they're debating Dvarim ha'omdim berumo shel olam, as we say in Hebrew. Existential matters of the human condition and of human society and of Jewish society within that. After the Holocaust, of course, Hersh has become even more cloistered into his position. And Chaim has more embraced humanism and global culture. At one point, Hersh asks him Chaim asks Hersh how he can continue to believe in God after the Holocaust. And Hersh says, how dare you ask how I can go on believing God? How can you go on believing in man? So what we're going to look at now is a dramatized reading that was produced by our friends at Mosaic magazine. And our thanks to them for allowing us to share this, to our good friend, John Silver, who heads Mosaic magazine. When the translation was first published about 2 years ago, in the thick of Corona, as I recall, on Mosaic magazine, before coming out in book form, Mosaic produced this very engaging, dramatized reading. It's abbreviated. It's not word for word, but it's certainly loyal to Ruth's translation. So it's about 4 minutes long or so. We're going to look at it, and then we're going to come back to talk about the ideas presented and the text that it shares. So here we go.
Now, if a man is good because it is worth his while today may pay off, and tomorrow, not. And if it still pays off tomorrow, you can't force him to stay in line. If a man has no God, why should he listen to the philosopher who tells him to be good? The philosopher himself is cold and gloomy, like a man who celebrates a marriage unto himself. The only way out of this, a man should choose between good and evil only as the Torah chooses for him. The Torah wants his happiness and knows better what is good for him. The Torah is the reality of life. Everything else is a dream. Even when a man understands rationally what he should do, he must never forget that before all else, he is doing it because the Torah commands it.
Okay.
That's how we can guard against the time when his reason will have no power to command him.
Yes.
Wait a moment. I'm not done yet. Now, the Torah is no guarantee either. A man may tell himself, well, I don't live according to reason, but according to the Torah. And he is certain that when temptation comes, he'll look into the appropriate book to see what he should do and follow its teaching. And he persuades himself that he is free. Actually, though, his freedom is bounded by his will. Even a man of Torah will not be able to withstand temptation unless he struggles with himself day and night. Only by good deeds can we drive out bad. Therefore, the Jews cried out at Sinai, Naaseh, we will do, only do, always do, v'nishma. And now we want to know what the Torah tells us to do. Without deeds, all deliberation is in vain. That is the outlook and the Musar path of the old one. Reb Yosef Yoitzel may be a merit and a shield for us. And thousands of Novaradak students steeped themselves in it day and night. We labored to make ourselves better. Each of us filed and polished his own soul, with examiners gathering evidence of our improvement like pearls. But you laughed at us. Then came the German. May his name be blotted out, and murdered our sainted students. And now, here we both stand before the devastated community of Israel. But you face the destruction of your own, the destruction of your faith in the world. That's what hurts you and torments you. So you ask me, why weren't the wise men of the Gentiles able to be good if they wanted to be good? And you find contradictions in what I said. But the contradiction you find is in yourself. You thought the world was striving to become better. But you discovered that it was striving for our blood. When Hitler's tanks and savage armies overran their wisdom and the wisdom of their sages, the ice of their reasoning cracked and all their goodness drowned. I mean, take that wise man whose statue stands up there with his instruments for measuring the stars and the planets. Right? When everyone else insisted, the sun revolves around the earth, he said, not so. You may draw and quarter me, chop me into pieces. The earth revolves around the sun. And what would he have said to his grandchildren today? If the spirit of life were returned to him, he would crawl down from his niche and strike his stone head against the cobblestones and recite lamentations.
So that was the clip. Now I want to look at the text for a moment. Before we do, I just for identification, our thanks to our friends at the Toby Press, publisher of my Quarrel with Hersh Rasseyner, as well as the publisher of the 15-volume Agnon library in English translation, who have made all of the titles in their catalog available at a 15% discount at tobypress.com using the promo code Quarrel. So if you haven't yet read my Quarrel with Hersh Rasseyner, give you this incentive to purchase a copy now and to read it. Also for station identification, I'll just make mention of the fact that Beit Agnon will be leading 2 learning touring seminars coming up in the spring and summer, the footsteps of Jewish life, literature, and learning in 2 different locations. In May in Portugal, and registration for that tour is already open at the website on the screen, agnonhouse.org.il/Portugal 2023. And in August, Germany, in the footsteps of Agnon's 12 years spent in Germany during World War I. So we encourage you to take a look at those offerings. They're usually really very wonderful, wonderful trips, very enjoyable, lovely group, excellent guides, and a tremendous opportunity to walk with book and literature and history in hand as we see different sites in Europe. Again, please visit us at Agnon House for our newsletters, give us a like on Facebook, and take a look at those books in the Agnon Library from Toby Press. But Ruth, I asked, really just for the music of it. Unfortunately, so few of us can read Hersh Rasseyner in the original Yiddish. And one of the really interesting things of this volume is that it's bilingual, which is, frankly, something of a curious choice, something that most publishers would not be interested in. But the work is bilingual. So this is a section on page 31, 32 in the Yiddish side of the volume. It's the text that more or less corresponds to what we just saw in the dramatization. So simply for the music of it, I wanted to hear you read some, all or some of the text here on the screen, so we can.
There must be, I think that people can find on YouTube probably Chaim Grade's voice, because he was never, unfortunately, no one had the wit to ask him to record this text. He should have been recording it, and he could have read both parts. And I would like to get back to that, both parts. But all right, from the best I can do.
Okay.
Nimnu vegamru, as der Emes und der Seichel is wie die Sonne, was muss aufgehen. Verschiedene Steger die Sonne mit Lopetes Erd. Ist gekommen in Meirev, a Scholit in Stiefel mit kleine Wonzelach. Und in Mizrach ist gekommen a Scholit in Stiefel mit große Wonzes. Und beide haben a Koppe getan den Chochem zu der Erd. Und ist gefallen in Blotta so tief, wie es hat gewollt in Meirev, der Scholit in die Stiefel mit die kleine Wonzelach. Und in Mizrach, der Scholit in die Stiefel mit die große Wonzes. Wird ihr sagen, die Chachomim haben gewollt, raten sehr leben. Verstehe ich. Aber sie haben doch geschrien, als Freiheit, Emes und Seichel seien beim Philosoph teurer wie sein Leben. Und auch der Chochem, der uns entgegen mit dem Machschirim zu messen, die Sterne und Masoles, dies alle haben geteilt. Die Sonne dreht sich, hat gesagt, Loi, ki die Erde dreht sich und vertelt mich, hackt mich, brockt mich. Was wollte gesagt zu seiner heimtigen Ähnlichkeit? Ob in dem amoligen Chochem wollte ich der herein, a Ruach Chaim, wollte herabgekrochen vom Fenster und geklappt mit seinen Steinen am Kopf in dem steinernen Bruch und gesagt, Echo.
So thank you for that. It's just such beautiful to hear, whether we fully understand it or not. But this is a passage from Hersh's diatribe, his monologue. Interestingly, there were some ellipses put into the dramatized reading, and some of what I think are the more powerful lines were taken out of the filmed part at this section. But here we see, again, this is on page 47, 48 of the text. Here we see that Hersh says, there's no shred of contradiction in my approach. The wise men of the Gentiles, even those who truly wished it, could not have become good to the very roots of their souls because they didn't have a Torah and they didn't work well all their lives to perfect their behavior. They deduced their ethics with the human mind. They followed their reasoned assumptions, the way you walk across a frozen river. But when Hitler's tanks and savage armies overran their wisdom and the wisdom of their sages, the ice of their reasoning cracked and all the goodness drowned. Well, that alone is just such a fabulous imagery. He goes on, along with their goodness to others, their own self-respect drowned too. Think of it. For the merest insult, they dueled with swords. They fought with fists and pistols. To keep public opinion from sneering or some fool from calling them cowards, afraid to die, they went to their death. For generations, their pride grew like a cancer until it consumed their flesh and sucked out their marrow. For ages, they debated, they talked, and they wrote. Does duty to nation and family come first? Or does the freedom of the individual come before his obligations to parents, wife, and children? Or even to himself? They deliberated and concluded. Nimnu v'gamru. That's, of course, an intertextual reference to the Talmud about the sages debating whether or not it was better for man to ever have been created or not. There are no bonds that a nation cannot break. truth, and reason are like the sun, which must rise every day. Just try to cover up the sun with shovelfuls of dirt. So there came in the west a booted ruler with a little mustache, and in the east a booted ruler with a big mustache. And both of them together kicked the wise man to the ground, and he sank into the mud. Of course, we recognize these as Hitler and Stalin. I suppose you'll say that the wise men wanted to save their lives. I can understand that, but didn't they just insist that freedom, truth, and reason were more precious to the philosopher than life itself? Take that wise man whose statue stands up there with his instruments for measuring the stars and the planets. And these are the lines that we saw in the clip. When everyone else insisted the sun revolves around the earth, he said, not so. You may draw and quarter me, chop me to pieces. The earth revolves around the sun. This is Galileo who's speaking. What would he have said to his grandchildren today? If the spirit of life would return to him, he would crawl down from his niche and strike his stone head against the cobblestones and recite Eicha, recite Lamentations. So this is the part I wanted to pitch back to you, Ruth, to examine. Because what's so fascinating is that in a dialogue between a character who so clearly is meant to be the projection of the author himself into his work, he gives some of the best lines to his opponent. Instead of creating Hersh Rasseyner as a straw man, he does quite the opposite. And you hinted at before, really, we're looking at an almost, these are my words, not yours, we're looking at almost like a split personality here. Because Chaim Grade, the author, not only can, because he's written both sides of this debate, but does embody both sides of the debate. The quarrel, the Krieg mit Hersh Rasseyner, is an argument that it seems to us, the reader, that Grade was having with himself. So help us understand this passage that we saw in film, in the Yiddish original, and in the excellent translation by yourself. Help us understand the thorn here in this passage.
Well, I think that you've articulated it pretty well, and the passage itself speaks for itself. But the question that you raise is about whose voice we are hearing. If we go back to the beginning of this work and we see how he sets it up the first time when Chaim Vilner has left the yeshiva, and he is there as a very committed young leftist idealist. He is mouthing all the platitudes of the young communists in the movement that he was a part of. In those years, Grade never liked to be reminded of this, but he wrote a poem, one of the most famous poems, or poems that was always quoted, had the refrain, Hey Chaver Grade, kum schließ sich an der Reuter Brigade. Hey, Comrade Grade, come and join the Red Brigade. He never liked to be reminded of that very much. And he said, well, it was a little ironic, and not at all. I mean, those were the days when Grade thought that, as most of the kids in those days who were writing really thought that that was the answer. Then the second little episode there is when he's very chastened because the Soviets have actually come in and taken over Vilna, which is where they both are, where they meet again. And the Soviets have the NKVD, and they are rounding up people, and they are making it impossible for anyone to speak or to publish or anything. And then it is Hersh Rasseyner who says, so Chaim, is this what you wanted? And Chaim says, I bear no more responsibility for them than you do for me. And Hersh says, you're wrong, Chaim. I do bear responsibility for you. So here's the point. This was Grade building into the story a mea culpa. He wanted this evolution to be out there for everyone to know who he had begun as and who he had become. Now, why did he create Hersh Rasseyner? Of course, it's based on someone, very good scholars. Irkin has found the person, Liebman, who actually
it's the model, the autobiographical model for the actual
autobiography. But really, as you say, having built so much of the having given so much of the argument to him, what is that? What is he doing? What is Hersh Rasseyner doing there? Well, the point is, a liberal writer could never say the things that Hersh Rasseyner gets to say about the West, about the Enlightenment, about how we sold ourselves, Jews, to the Enlightenment. See, a liberal Jew like Grade wanted to play to a liberal audience, basically, and all the rest of it. And who knew who his audience was? Who reads Yiddish literature, after all? People who were reading Yiddish literature were secular Jews, most of them, right? It's strange that he then is taken over by a large part of the Orthodox community. But his original audience was, of course, labor Zionists and people who, secular Jews. He gave Hersh Rasseyner the words that he could not say in his own mouth, the anger that he could not express in his own being, the hatred, basically, of the West, and the hatred in this sense, self-hatred, because we had gone along with this. We allowed ourselves to believe this. So when Rasseyner is speaking those words, he is really saying, we went along with the Greeks, and we said that the Greeks were so magnificent and all the rest of it. And these people whom you're pointing to, these statues here on the Hotel de Ville, these wonderful people. And let's say also that Chaim Wilner makes this argument in his own voice. Look at these wonderful works that these people created. Don't they?
Art, culture.
Art, culture. Don't they uplift the spirit? Don't they make us better people? That is what Rasseyner comes down hardest on. He says, really? Did they live as they wrote? And that's why he says that so he comes at the defense of the Torah from many directions. But one of the strongest directions from which he comes is to say their route to morality is a total and absolute failure. And any one of us that takes that route is failed. And that is why Hersh Rasseyner really tries so hard in this to rescue his friend. He keeps trying to say to him, "Si schonenter wie weiter." The time is already coming. We're closer to the end than we are to the beginning. And Wilner is very shaken by that. He says, what do you mean? What do you mean? And Rasseyner says, Chaim, you don't have that much time left. You have to really understand, what are we talking about here? After the Shoah, after this Churban, you can say these stupid things about these people up there and them uplifting when we're standing here on the blood of Europe, you see? So this is Grade, you're right, a quarrel with himself, but you have to see which side he's giving.
Well, actually, he does give one kind of powerful line or admission or recognition of the reality in the mouth of Chaim himself, when Hersh points to a group of passing non-Jews or something, says, that's your crowd. You want to be on their team. There's your people. And Chaim says back, if I have the Yiddish right, I think he says, Hersh, was für euch ist treif, is noch für sein nicht kosher. And you have a good time in the translation here, because I think you make a great improvement over the earlier translation. But the point being, that's in English we might say, just because you don't like me doesn't mean that they're going to be my friend. Just because you think I'm treif doesn't mean that they think I'm kosher. And that's a rather candid admission of the weakness of his argument about the brotherhood of man and the universalism of culture and the value of that uplifting Western society.
Yes, and that's right. And yet, I mean, we have to say, you and I, we're not Novaradok. I mean, the strange thing is we read this and look at how much passion you've poured into this text and how much you have come to possess it, and as we all have, and as students do, by the way. And I don't know whether I wrote this, but in teaching this work, as I have done often, at the end, I used to do this. I don't think I would do it anymore. I used to say, who wins the debate? Do you think that there is a debate? Who do you think has the stronger arguments? Always, they thought that Rasseyner had the stronger arguments, although, of course, the class itself would have gone in the direction of Vilner.
Yeah.
But they saw from the text, when you started reading them and you saw the argument. So that's why I think it is worth pausing on this text. It isn't everything, Jeffrey. You know, some people have really pointed out wisely that there's no middle ground. For example, Jews found answers. Those who became Zionists and went to live in the land of Israel found a combination that neither of these people refers to here.
I mean, the fact that that dialogue takes place in 1948, the final, you know, the bulk of the book takes place in 1948, right. And there's no reference at all to Zionism, to Israel, to nothing, right?
No, because it isn't that. So you can't ask for everything from every text. That, again, to go back to this, he was very focused. It is not, and as a matter of fact, one of the things that was written by Eddie Alexander, one of the first people to write a major essay about this work, he said that this is a work of Holocaust literature. This is the work of Holocaust literature. Well, as wonderful as that essay is, I take issue with that. I think this is a work of anti-Holocaust literature.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that the main thing that happens in this book is that the Holocaust makes absolutely no essential difference to their debate. The same argument, secular versus observant. Are we going to be halachic Jews or are we going to be secular Jews, you know, using halachic, you know, whatever we want of the halacha? Which are we going to be? This is really the essential debate. And what I think is so remarkable about this is that those 9 years in between, or 11 years in between, no reference is made to them. The idea is we go back. The
conversation picks up exactly where we left off.
Picks up exactly where it is. Now, of course, it's more intense. And each of them brings evidence of what they have, because even Vilner says, look, what about these good people who saved some Jewish lives? What are you going to say about them? Are you not going to admit that there can be goodness in the world without halacha? Are you not saying that these people existed? So he tries to make an argument too of the basis of the evidence, but it's not that. It's the real debate is the same debate, much more intensified by what has been done to the Jews in the meantime and to the world in the meantime.
As interesting, as fascinating, as imperative as our engagement with the ideas in Hersh Rasseyner is, I want to pause for a moment over your work as translator. As we mentioned, there was an earlier translation which you found somewhat problematic. It also omitted certain passages that you wanted filled in, and you described that at first you thought you would just, you know, fill in and verteichen verbessen here and there, but you realized you had to really start from scratch. Part of the differences in the translation, of course, are the differences in time. You've produced a far more Jewish translation. Earlier translators, and by the way, we struggle with very similar phenomena, and we see different trends in Agnon translation. Sure. And in many ways, despite, of course, that Singer and Grade were both writing in Yiddish and Agnon in Agnonian Hebrew, Grade is much closer to Agnon, because Agnon, I mean, you mentioned earlier that Singer was writing in America in Polish Yiddish, and Grade was Litvish, and he was so much more rooted in the world of the yeshiva, and Navardik hadn't left him. So I tried to tease out in reading the passage of the translation some of those intertextualities that are at play there, which aren't essential to understanding the simple meaning of the text, but when you start peeling away the layers of the onion and understand that he's in dialogue with rabbinic texts and Talmudic texts or biblical texts, that this adds a profound level of engagement. But that provides as you and I both know, a great challenge to the translator. So you say a word about some of that, how it played out in your work and decisions you had to make in doing that?
Well, I did not have a holistic kind of theory about how I was going to go about this. I used every sentence as it came up and tried to make the decision on that basis. But it might be interesting for the listeners here who have heard the passage. Those two actors were not Jewish.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. So they could learn the words, you see, they could learn the words. But the thing is that when you move into another language, you have to ask yourself the question, are you writing for Jews in that other language, or are you sending this book out into the world? And what I would make the case that there is hardly a Jewish text that is as relevant to Christians, to Jews, to non-Jews in other traditions, in other religious traditions than this text. I mean, I think that one of our jobs is to build the culture. And I will make a pitch for this. You know, we think sometimes that the culture consists of everything that we put out there. You're putting out these libraries, you're doing this wonderful work. Oh, if we could get another book out there, how wonderful that would be. My feeling is that the culture really consists of how much of this is absorbed, which is the work that you're doing. And so the real thing is, who's going to absorb this? So of course, your first idea is that this will be absorbed as a text which people can argue and build on and adapt for their own purposes. But I think we would be doing the text a great disservice if we did not, and I'm trying to get it reviewed in Christian publications, for example, it was reviewed yesterday in the Wall Street Journal very wonderfully. I mean, I think that we have to tell others why this is so important, humanly important.
It would be so fascinating to be a fly on the wall listening to it taught at a seminar in a Christian university.
You can do it.
I can't do it, but it can be done.
Well, you can. I mean,
if I was on the faculty of such a university, I guess I could.
Well.
But that would make for a fascinating test case. But for example, that line in Yiddish, which I either butchered or pronounced.
Yes, because yes.
What for you is not kosher doesn't mean that for the non-Jews, nicht kosher.
Well, there's a concept.
So that's actually one of the interesting anecdotes in your translation and how you differed from the earlier translations.
Yes, very well put. Milton Himmelfarb, who was the first brilliant translator of this, they did this with Irving Howe in a time in 1952 when they were just trying to introduce Yiddish into the American public. Now, Maurice Samuel
introduced Yiddish literature in translation to the American public.
Exactly, introduce Yiddish literature and things about Yiddish. So the kind of thing that you had is say it in Yiddish and taking all the jokes out and making you
joy Yiddish.
Yes, and sort of using Yiddishisms and trying to sell it on that basis. Maurice Samuel, who was a brilliant man, by the way,
translated so much of Shalom Aleichem.
Yes, but what he did is he wrote the world of Shalom Aleichem. He rewrote these stories. He appropriated it completely. He took out sections, he changed them. I mean, he really inserted himself into the text because they then had no respect for the absolute integrity of the text. They thought what they wanted was to get across how wonderful this text was. And the only way to get it across is to make it more accessible. So it's this question of how accessible are you going to make it? Today, it's a wonderful thing. We don't really need that many glossaries because if you have a computer,
everybody's carrying around the collected wisdom of civilization in their pocket.
Exactly. And if there's a word there that you don't know, within a minute, you can find them. You know, nimnu vegamru, it's there. All you have to do is type it in and you'll find out what it means, where it appears, and so forth. So that's a help. And that makes certain things accessible for the person who wants to take the trouble. In answer to your question, really, my feeling was that, yes, I want to make it as true to the original as I possibly can, and as welcoming to the English reader as I possibly can, but never at the expense of making something accessible by changing it in some fundamental way.
Well, another challenge to the translator, which I think you've also observed, is not cases where there's a reference to, like that line, which about what's kosher isn't necessarily, what's treif is not necessarily not kosher. So you can translate it, and it almost has it. There's almost kind of like pseudo Talmudic ring to it.
Yes.
But the reader, our Christian students in that Christian university, when they'll study this book next semester, hopefully they'll get it. They'll understand what it is. And if you use the word treif and kosher, and if they don't know what that are, they can find it in a second. But maybe sometimes the bigger challenge today is when you have a word which is the word itself is just a stand-in for an entire world of associations. I think you point to the word in Yiddish, sviva, from the back formed from the Hebrew sviva, which you translate, I think, as environment or surrounding or milieu or something like that. But that's not what a sviva is.
No.
It's a kind of all-encompassing, all Jewish, top to bottom, cradle to grave existence. It's the air you breathe, and that's something which in fact might get lost in translation. But
God, I mean, look, I took courses in Russian literature. German I knew well enough to read the German, but Russian I never learned well enough to read the Russian. I could check it out against the dictionary, but I couldn't read it. Do you know how much one loses reading Isaac Babel in translation? I mean, I would say that I'm sure I lose 25 to 50% somewhere, because he is so precise about his language. But I have 5 translations now. And so when I read a story, I can read it in 5 translations. Among the 5 of them, I sort of figure, well,
we'll map out the.
That's right. I kind of figure out where it stands.
In my work, I'm asked all the time, usually by, Israelis displaying a certain amount of natural chauvinism. How can you translate Agnon? How could you read Agnon in translation? Which is ridiculous. We all read in translation. Translation allows us to be tourists in another culture. And if that other culture, like Yiddish or Hebrew, happens to be a culture which is also my culture, although I might be handicapped because of my limitations, so I'm able to enter it. We all know things are lost in translation, but the value of a translation such as yours is to really open not just the words, but the worlds of the ideas that are embedded there. So as always, for this and for so much else, we are so grateful to you.
I'm very grateful to you for this. Thank you.
Again, I remind all of our participants online to visit our friends at tobypress.com using the promo code Quarrel to get 15% off purchase of this book, of the Agnon Library, of all of the volumes available at Toby Press, Magid, and Korean publishers, which are all part of one operation. To visit us at agnonhouse.org.il, sign up for our newsletters to hear about other events we'll be having. I know that many of you are new to Zoom here at Agnon House because we don't always have programming in English, but we hope that you'll sign up and join us for Hebrew programming, for English programming. And those of you that would like to travel with us to Portugal in May or to Germany in August, please pay attention to that and be in touch. We'd be happy to have you along for the trip. So Ruth, we touched on so many different things that we bookmarked for future conversations. So we promise our viewers that we're going to come back again. We won't wait a whole year. Last year, we had a fascinating conversation about the 3 Jewish Nobel laureates of a certain decade, Agnon, Saul Bellow, and Isaac Bashevis Singer, and what that moment in Jewish literature meant, that the 3 of them won the Nobel within a short amount of time. That recording of that session is available on our YouTube page as this will be available going forward also. And we look forward to continuing these conversations with all of you.
Thank you.
So, thank you all very much, and thank you
Thank
to
everybody who joined in. Thank you.